the first round, we'll have Minnie Blackman versus Maggie Crane. For the second, we'll have Jonathan Amlong versus Lucas Shum. And then third, we'll have Ethan Barnes versus Holly Miriam. So you guys should see some good closing arguments today. That's what we have up for you. So now I will first introduce our faculty advisor, Professor Katie Hester. And I forgot to say, I'm Maddie Seymour. I'm the vice chair of internal competitions for TrialAd, and I'll also let everyone else introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Babby, and I am the vice chair.
I'm Stephanie Pasquale, and I'm the in-house coordinator.
Todd Conklin, chair.
I'm Mia Fono, and I'm the vice chair of membership development.
So just a couple of things. Thank you all so much for being here. I have thoroughly enjoyed working with TrialAd. I very much take a position that this is a student-run organization. So in truth, the work is done by these individuals, absolutely. It is not something where I tell them what to do. I very much think that it has been, the growth over the past few years has been fantastic. As you all know, as new members, there's lots of things that go into this preparation-wise. And I look forward to working with you over the next 1 to 2 years, depending on where you are in this process. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hester. And very briefly, before we get started, I wanted to congratulate all of our new 2Ls and our top 6 competitors. So congratulations to all of you. And I wanted to recognize Maddie Seymour, our internal chair, for all the work that she has done to make this event possible. So round of applause. And with that, top 6 competitors head to the small courtroom, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sorry, the TrialAd room, not the small courtroom, this way.
This way.
I'll go.
No, yeah, y'all can just.
Prosecutor to the jury. Whoever had the verdict.
I did that yesterday. That'll be no, you're good.
What was the Georgia v. Allen? That's
The state of Mississippi versus Jolene Tremont is now come to order. Judge Todd Conklin presiding. You may be seated.
Now stand back up. You may be seated. Yes. All right, I now call this matter to order in the state of Mississippi versus Jolene Tremont. Is the prosecution ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Prosecution, proceed with your closing argument.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, permission to move freely about the well.
Yes, but keep a respectful distance of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. And I'm also asking to reserve any remaining time that I have for rebuttal.
It'll be reserved.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Love can make you do crazy things. Jolene Tremont was an abandoned, lonely housewife. Her husband, he was facing a busy season at work. Imagine how startled Jolene would have been to find out that he was using what little free time he had left, texting another woman. She couldn't believe it. She even had to go see with her own 2 eyes. So she went to Bunky's bar to see her husband and his mistress. Now, we're not denying that the defendant loved her husband, but love can make you do crazy things. She went up to her husband. She said, "Don't do this. Come home." But he refused. This made her see red. And that is when she abandoned all prior plans she had for that night and came up with a new one. She grabbed a knife from the bar, putting it in her trench coat pocket. Then, grabbing a baseball bat, also putting it in her trench coat pocket, she went outside. She went outside knowing that her husband's truck had been parked there, and knowing that she had time before her Uber would come to pick her up. She went outside and she took her anger out on his vehicle. She slashed his tires. She bashed his headlights. And she did this, and this is what caused him to crash. Then and only then did she get into her Uber to go home. Once home, she had a couple glasses of wine. Then she texted a friend to say, "Please don't tell anyone I was at the bar that night," creating an alibi for herself. Now, the vandalism of that car caused her husband to crash, and that is why we as the state have charged Jolene Tremont, the defendant, with second-degree murder. Now, to prove second-degree murder, we had to prove all of this evidence that we've presented in trial today beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, members of the jury, that does not mean beyond all doubt, just that is reasonable. The judge will give you more stringent instructions about how we had to prove second-degree murder, but for right now, all you need to know is that the events occurred on October 21st, 2021, when Jacob Tremont was a human being, and that the defendant acted dangerously with no regard for human life. Now, let's go through each of these and I'll tell you how we proved them. Firstly, we had to prove that the events occurred on or about October 21st, 2021 in Lafayette County. You know that the defendant was at the bar that night because she testified. She said that she was there. You also saw evidence of an Uber receipt detailing each location she had been that night, all of which had been in the limits of Lafayette County. Secondly, we had to prove that Jacob Tremont was a human being. He made a mistake like all human beings do. He had an affair. Thirdly, we had to prove that Jolene Tremont acted dangerously without regard for human life. Now, you heard about 3 separate figures, and all of the stuff that you heard from them proves that she did that. Firstly, you heard from Detective Maddox Seymour. Now, the defense wants you to focus on one minor mistake that the detective had done in all of her 8 years of service on a police force. However, we want you to look past that. While we do not deny that this happened, we want you to realize that the detective learned her lesson, and she has been lead detective ever since that mistake. And there's a reason for that. Detective Seymour told you about a knife that went missing from the bar only right before the defendant went outside. She also told you about a baseball bat. A baseball bat which was tested and matched the wooden chips that were embedded into Jacob Tremont's vandalized vehicle. Now, you also heard from the defendant herself, Jolene Tremont. You heard that she went to the bar that night. You heard that she was angry. She went to the bar that night in a trench coat because she didn't even want to speak to her husband. But seeing her husband with his mistress made her see red. Love can make you do crazy things. She begged him to come home. He refused. So she grabbed the knife and she grabbed the bat and the trench coat she told you she was wearing. She even told you she noticed his truck outside. She even told you she had time and that she didn't immediately go from Funky's and get into her Uber. However, what she didn't tell you was that she vandalized his truck, an eminently dangerous act, an act that caused his car to crash. The defense is also going to tell you about a third figure, Harley Dennis. Harley Dennis was the manager at Funky's, and Harley Dennis could not have done this act because Harley Dennis was working. Harley Dennis did not have the time. Now, all of this evidence speaks to the truth that Jolene Tremont committed this crime. And we are asking that you go back and return a verdict of guilty because love can make you do crazy things. Thank you.
Defense, you may be when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state has presented to you a theory of what happened on October 21st, 2021 that sounds like something ripped out of a country music song. They allege that Jolene, in an act of fury, acted like Carrie Underwood. She took a Louisville Slugger to one headlight, slashed a hole in all four tires because Jake was cheating on her. And that those alleged actions caused Jake's truck to run off the road that night. But ladies and gentlemen, Jolene did not take away her man. You heard it yourself. She admitted to being in Funky's that night. She went there to confirm with her own eyes that Jake was being unfaithful to her. And she confronted Jake. She freely told you that. She confronted Jake and begged him to come home, reminded him of their love and their 3 children and said, "Come home, Jake." And then Jolene did what she's always done. She's held her head up high as much as a woman who is heartbroken from her husband's unfaithfulness, walked out of Funky's, walked down to where her Uber was waiting, got in her Uber and went home and did what she does for Jake every single day. She took care of their home and waited and waited and waited for him to come home so they could work things out. And she waited until she learned the awful truth that Jake died that night. Ladies and gentlemen, marriage is hard. There is going to be good times and there is going to be bad times, but Jolene, she was going to stand by her man that night. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Jolene and her 3 kids, they now live every day with the uncertainty of what exactly happened to Jake that evening because Detective Seymour failed to do his job. And it's not just a little mistake like the prosecution would have you believe. Detective Seymour admitted to you that she was discharged from the Army for overlooking evidence, dishonorably discharged for overlooking evidence. And that's exactly what's happened in this case. Now, granted, Detective Seymour, he matched the wood from the broken headlight of Jake's truck to the baseball bat owned by Harley Dennis, but did Detective Seymour test that bat for any DNA or look for fingerprints, something a homicide investigator with 15 murders under her belt should know to do? No. Did Detective Seymour ask or look for where that knife that Harley Dennis reported missing, where that knife could have gone? No. Now you might be thinking, ladies and gentlemen, Harley Dennis's name has popped up quite a bit in this trial. And that's because you're smart folks. You can see what Detective Seymour plainly did not see. That Harley Dennis is not just an eyewitness to the key events. on the night that Jake died, but is a suspect in those events. Now, we know that Harley Dennis owned that bat that he kept at Funky's. Harley Dennis reported that knife missing from his own bar. Now, the prosecution wants you to think that Harley Dennis didn't have enough time or even the wherewithal. Why would he want to go after Jake's truck? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard from Jolie that Dennis and Jake knew each other, that Jake was a regular at Funky's, and Harley Dennis was the one person at Funky's who saw Jolene, heartbroken, confront her husband for his infidelity. He is the one person at Funky's that saw Jake flirt and kiss and hug a woman who was not his wife. That's motive enough for a good friend betrayed by his own friend's disloyalty to his wife. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of uncertainty in this case, but we know that Harley Dennis had access to that knife, to that bat, and had the time and motive to go after Jake's truck. Now, you're going to hear this all again in jury instructions, but it's important, so I want to emphasize it to you, that you are to presume Jolene innocent of these crimes, because it is upon the prosecution to show by a burden of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the central element of this crime, that Jolene, through tampering with her husband's car, acted in an eminently dangerous way that led to Jake's death. But I want you to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the state has not presented any evidence, anything that could give you beyond a reasonable doubt, any evidence that puts that knife or that bat in Jolene's hands. The state can't even provide evidence that the reason Jake's truck went off the road that night was by any damage that was done that evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think and look at all the evidence that you've heard today at trial and see what Officer Seymour clearly failed to see, that Jolene had nothing to do with her husband's death. You heard her on the stand under oath that she had nothing to do with Jake's death. They were college sweethearts. She loved him and she wanted to work things out. She was going to stand by her man. So, ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you return a verdict of not guilty for second-degree murder. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Rebuttal.
Your Honor, may I ask how much time is left?
You have 15 seconds.
Your Honor, I'd like to use the rebuttal.
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Now, the defense is once again trying to pin this on Harley Davis, who had no time whatsoever. The defense told you he was friends with Jacob Tremont and even said when Jacob Tremont was found dead, that bastard, I can't believe he died. He was saddened. He did not have anything to do with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Both parties are dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
prosecution sits closest to the jury.
Sorry. And it doesn't.
Is the prosecution ready to proceed? Is the defense ready to proceed?
Yes. Yes, Your Honor.
Prosecution, you may begin when you're ready.
May it please the court. Members of the jury, the tale of this case is a tale told 1,000 times. It's the story of a vengeful lover who, upon finding out that her husband was with someone else, decided to take the matter into her own hands. Now, jury, you've heard the story. You've heard the testimony, the witnesses, the evidence, and the facts. But allow me to recount it for you one last time and tell you the events of what really happened leading up to the death of Jacob Tremont. Now, Jacob had been telling his wife, the defendant, that he had been hanging out and communicating with a buddy from work named Todd. Now, unfortunately, this Todd ended up actually being a woman he was romantically involved with. Now, when the defendant found that out, she sent a threatening text message to Jacob's mistress, Taylor Drift, threatening both Jacob's truck and herself, saying, quote, "It'd be a shame if something happened to his truck or you." After finding out that her husband and Miss Drift were going to meet up at Funky's in town, she did what the vengeful lover does. She confronted them. When she saw them, she said that she, quote, "saw red," went up to them, yelled at them, said some curse words, and witnesses reported hearing her say, "If I can't have him, nobody can." Then she stormed out of the bar, but not before taking the paring knife from behind the bar and the baseball bat kept just outside the front. She then took these weapons and used the bat to smash Jacob's headlight of his truck and stab all 4 of his tires. Now, members of the jury, we've all had emotional moments. We've all done things out of anger. But thankfully, we are afforded the ability to have time afterwards to reflect on our actions and minimize damage. The defendant was no different in this case. But what did she do after destroying her husband's truck? Did she tell her husband, "Don't drive this home"? Did she warn anybody? No. She took an Uber home. She cracked open a bottle of wine and folded laundry like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, her husband was taking his last breaths after driving off the road and crashing. She was sipping on Merlot and folding her underwear. Now, as the prosecution, we have the burden to prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, in an act reckless to human life, killed her husband. Essentially, she vandalized the truck, resulting in the death of her husband. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt, what exactly does that mean? You don't hear that term often in everyday discourse. A way I like to think about it is by explaining it with a metaphor. Imagine for a moment you come home from work, you see a mud puddle in front of your front porch, you see the front door is open. You get out of your car, you walk inside, and you see muddy paw prints all throughout the floor. You then go in your kitchen, and you see your dog with mud on his paws. Now, jury, you didn't see your dog create these paw prints. You didn't see him walk throughout the house. However, you can easily and beyond any reasonable doubt determine that it was your dog who created these prints. Now, unfortunately, this case is not quite as simple. They never are. But I know that you have the testimony, the evidence, and the facts to make a determination of guilt. Now, the defense would love for you to believe that all of these things you heard are just a series of coincidences. They want you to believe that the threatening text message going to Miss Drift at the same time the defendant found out about the affair is just a coincidence. They would love for you to believe that the knife going missing at the same time that the defendant left the bar is just a coincidence. They want you to believe that the baseball bat matching exactly with the samples of wood taken from the headlight of the truck is just a coincidence. And perhaps most damningly, they want you to believe that the 4-inch deep puncture marks on the tires matching exactly with the length of the missing paring knife is just a coincidence. But jury, I ask you, at a certain point, don't these coincidences add up? They add up and tell the story of the vengeful lover, who upon seeing her husband with another man, vandalized his car and killed him. Now, unfortunately, jury, there's nothing you can do today that will bring back Jacob Tremont. There's nothing you can do that will return a father to his children. And there's nothing you can do that will fill the hole left by his absence in the community. But you do have one power. You have the ability to make sure justice is granted. You can find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. You can bring justice for Jacob's family, his friends, and his loved ones. So, jury, I ask you, please return a guilty verdict for the defendant of second-degree murder. Thank you.
Defense, you may proceed when you're ready.
May I please the court? Opposing counsel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, just because someone is angry, that does not make them a murderer. That's what the prosecution just tried to tell you. That because Jolene was angry, she must have killed her husband. That's a big gap between these things. A gap left unfilled by the prosecution in this case. You see, Jolene is a family-loving woman. She loves her community. She loves her children. She loved her husband. In fact, she loved her husband so much that even after finding evidence on his phone that he was having an affair, she needed to see it for herself to believe it. And when she gets to the bar, she looks across the room and her deepest fears are realized. There was her husband with another woman, playing pool together, drinking together, flirting together. And as the sadness built up inside her, she decided to confront the two, telling the mistress, "That's my husband, we're married. We have 3 children together." And then turning to the husband, "You need to put an end to this now. I'll be waiting for you at home." And then reasonably so, she stormed out of the bar, got in the Uber, and took the lonely trip home. So yeah, Jolene was angry, but that does not make her a murderer. And as it turns out, Jolene was not the only person that was angry at Mr. Tremont that night. No, Harley Dennis, the bartender at Funky's that evening, was also angry at Mr. Tremont. Taylor Drift was the mistress of Mr. Tremont and was with Mr. Tremont that night. And he described Mr. Dennis's attitude towards the two as angry at their presence, and that Mr. Dennis seemed off. And then you heard from Detective Seymour. He told you that at the scene of the accident, there were little pieces of baseball bat inside the headlight of Mr. Tremont's truck. And these little pieces of baseball bat were actually little pieces of the baseball bat propped up against the employee entrance at Funky's. The same entrance that Mr. Dennis would have used every night to start his shift. Detective Seymour also told you that Mr. Tremont's tires were slashed. And as it turns out, there was a missing paring knife from behind the same bar that Mr. Dennis was responsible for as the bartender that evening. And when Mr. Dennis was told that Mr. Tremont had been killed, he didn't say, "Well, who did it?" No, all he could say was, "That bastard died. I can't believe it." So here's what we're left with. Over here, we have this cloud of confusion surrounding Mr. Dennis. Why did he have such disdain for Mr. Tremont and Miss Drift that night? Why were the tools used to cause the death of Mr. Tremont so accessible to Mr. Dennis, but they wouldn't have been accessible to Jolene? And why did Mr. Dennis have such an odd reaction when he found out about Mr. Tremont's death? Why? But at the same time, over here, the prosecution is saying, "Don't worry about this cloud of confusion, nothing to see here. Let's just focus on Jolene." Jolene Tremont is being charged with second-degree murder. And the judge will later explain this a little more thoroughly. But put simply, prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jolene Tremont acted without regard for human life and that those actions led to the death of Mr. Tremont. Let's talk about reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt means that if you sat here during this trial, you heard all the evidence, and you still have reasonable doubt that Jolene was responsible for Mr. Tremont's death, you should return a verdict of not guilty. Thinking about reasonable doubt another way, people have reasonable doubt all the time. Imagine someone about to leave their home. They pick up their phone and their wallet off the counter and they put it in their pockets. They're about to close the door and then they do this, checking for their phone and their wallet. Now, they may have known that they put their phone and wallet in their pocket, but they just needed to be sure. And it's at that moment where you check for your phone and your wallet that you have reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is where the prosecution's case fails. You heard Detective Seymour tell you that he knew about the baseball bat and that Harley Dennis owned it. That's reasonable doubt. You heard Detective Seymour tell you that he knew about the missing paring knife, missing from behind the same bar that Harley Dennis was responsible for. That's reasonable doubt. And you heard Detective Seymour tell you that he knew about the odd reaction that Mr. Dennis had when finding out about Mr. Tremont's death. That's reasonable doubt. And with the prosecution's burden to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, they're unable to. In fact, best prosecution in the world cannot prove this beyond a reasonable doubt because of this air of confusion surrounding Mr. Dennis. When the investigators don't do their job, the prosecution cannot do their job. Would we be surprised to find out that Detective Seymour didn't do his job after he told us during this trial that he was kicked out of the military for overlooking evidence during the investigation? And then you also heard from my client, Jolene. She sat here, she told you that she was heartbroken when she found out that her husband had died. How much her husband meant to her family. And you saw the text messages between Jolene and her friend Casey. The text messages where they talked about the future of the couple's relationship. And you saw the Uber receipt, putting Jolene on her way home an hour before Mr. Tremont had been killed. Just because someone is angry, that does not make them a murderer. And Jolene Tremont is not a murderer. And I ask you to return a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you to both of you. This case is concluded. Both are dismissed. Is the prosecution ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is the defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Prosecution, proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Members of the jury, this is a sad story. A story of jealousy, rage, and a dead father. A dead father ripped from his children because of the unlawful actions of a jealous wife. Jacob Tremont was a good man, a hard-working man. He had spent the last couple months down on the coast helping rebuild our state's infrastructure after the recent hurricane. But like all of us, he was not a perfect man. While down on the coast, he entered into a relationship with a woman who was not his wife. And they had texted back and forth for a few months before he decided to invite her up to Oxford to come and see him. Now, a few days before her arrival, his wife, going through his phone, became aware of the relationship and saw that they were planning to meet up at a bar here in town named Bunky's. She talked to her sister, she talked to her friend, both of whom advised her that she should go and confront him. And she did. She went to the bar that night, dressed in all black, with a hat on, a disguise. She then waited at the bar until she saw the right moment, confronting her husband, which in a way was described by the bar manager as a fury, and described, admittedly by the defendant, of a rage so intense she saw red. Now, after this confrontation while walking out, witness testimony says she muttered the words, "If I can't have him, no one can." Paints a very ominous picture. She then left the bar, where the bar manager reported shortly after her leaving that a knife and a bat had gone missing. She went out into the parking lot, took this knife and bat, went to her husband's truck, which she admittedly recognized. She then proceeded to slash all 4 of his tires and smash his headlight with a baseball bat. Now, later that night, while he was driving home, due to the slashes in his tire failed. It caused him to crash into a group of trees, killing him and severely injuring the woman he was with. Now, here today, the defendant is charged with second-degree murder, which means we must prove to you, members of the jury, that the defendant vandalized her husband's truck with no regard to how that vandalism might affect him later down the road, and that it killed him. And that is exactly what happened here today. Again, while driving home after the vandalism occurred, his tire failed. He crashed into a group of trees, tearing him from his children and severely injuring the woman he was with. This is a terrible story, a story of jealousy, rage, and now a dead father. Now, we must prove this charge to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And beyond a reasonable doubt is kind of a tough standard to understand. So let me see if I can break it down to help you digest it a little bit better. Let's say you walk into your home. You see your lipstick all over the ground. It's smeared. It looks like somebody took a bite out of it. Now, you then look over to your couch and you see your fluffy white dog, purple in the face. Did you see your dog get into your makeup bag? No. Did you see your dog take a bite of your lipstick? No. But when you look at the big picture, when you look at this scenario from a bird's eye view, it's quite clear the story that the facts present. And that's exactly what we have here. Now, we've heard from the detective who witnessed the crash with his own eyes, who saw the slashes in the tires, who saw the smashed headlight. We've heard from the bar manager who described the confrontation as a fury, who, after the defendant left, reported a knife and a bat stolen. A bat which, when tested, exactly matched the wood shards left in this broken headlight. We've heard from witness testimony that says that the defendant left from her confrontation, she herself admitted was so intense she saw red, that she muttered the words, "If I can't have him, no one can." Again, a very ominous statement considering what's happened. We know she had the motive. She was jealous. She admitted that they had had trust issues their whole relationship. She admitted that communication was off. She admitted that she'd been seeing less and less of him lately. We know she was angry. She herself admitted this confrontation was so intense she saw red. The bar manager said it was a fury. And now we have a dead father. A father who will never see his children again. Now, here shortly, members of the jury, you will receive your jury instructions. And on these instructions, you'll see the standard of reasonable doubt. which I hope I've made a little more digestible to you guys today. You'll see the elements of the crime, second-degree murder, which again, we must prove to you that she vandalized the defendant, vandalized her husband's truck with no regard to how that vandalism would affect him later, and that it killed him, which again, it did. We have 3 fatherless children now because of the unlawful actions of a jealous wife. It's an unfortunate story. I implore you, members of the jury, to find the defendant guilty. The evidence supports it, the law requires it, and justice here today must prevail. Thank you. Going on the prosecution press.
Thank you. Defense, proceed when you're ready.
Members of the jury, sometimes the obvious answer is the right one. On October 20th, 2021, Mr. Jake Tremont and his wife, Miss Jolene Tremont, were having some marriage troubles, something that could happen to anyone. That evening, Mr. Jake Tremont and his lover, Miss Taylor Drift, went to the bar Funky's, where they drank all night. Miss Tremont arrives, understandably upset, even understandably, as the prosecution said, if she was furious that her husband and the father of her children was cheating on her. In the early hours of October 21st, 2021, Mr. Jake Tremont and Miss Drift get in his truck after drinking all night. The truck hits a pothole, the tire deflates, and they hit a tree, killing Mr. Jake Tremont. Now, the prosecution has charged Miss Jolene Tremont with second-degree murder. And for that, they must prove that Jolene Tremont, without authority of law, killed Mr. Jacob Tremont and the commission of an act eminently dangerous to others, that is, tampering with his truck. And at the beginning of this trial, the prosecution made you a promise, members. They promised that they would prove each and every element of this offense beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, you've heard from witnesses, you've seen evidence, you've even heard their arguments. But members, what you have not heard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Jolene Tremont caused her husband's death. Now, you're going to receive instructions, and on there it's going to tell you that every person charged with the commission of a crime is innocent, and it's the prosecution's job to prove each and every element of that beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the prosecution gave you a nice analogy of reasonable doubt. However, I feel like our story is a little bit different. There you have a dog with lipstick on it, but you also have a 2-year-old with lipstick on him. And also, your lipstick was left open on the counter with the window next to it. Maybe it blew off and your Roomba got it all over there. Maybe the child rubbed it all over the dog. And members, that's more like what happened here. Mere probability will never warrant a conviction. Members, you heard from Detective Seymour, who was kicked out of the military for evidence issues during an ongoing investigation, who failed to acquire a toxicology report on Mr. Tremont, who failed to ask Ms. Taylor Drift questions about the text message from an unknown number, who only had a work week of detective training, who failed to ask Harley Dennis questions about the bag which caused the truck's headlights to be busted, or why he was angry about Mr. Tremont and his paramour's presence. He didn't test them out for prints. He didn't find the knife. He didn't even confirm the knife was what caused the issues with the tires. He also didn't question key witnesses such as Jim and Casey. And his testimony today and in his initial report conflict with the supplemental narrative. How can you trust any of the evidence in this case? Members, that alone is reasonable doubt. You also heard from two witnesses who heard that her husband was upset that the father of her children was cheating on her. Two witnesses that in an unbiased investigation would have been looked at as suspects. Miss Taylor Drift found out her dream guy had a wife and kids. Harley Dennis was the owner of the bag. He was never even asked the simple question of why he was angry. Neither of these witnesses were asked whether or not Mr. Tremont was intoxicated when he arrived at the bar, Members, you've also heard about the truck and the slashes in the tires. However, remember, the prosecution has shown you no evidence that Mrs. Tremont took the knife or even that the knife caused the slashes. Members, you just heard that the knife went missing in a busy bar with multiple employees. You also heard about how only one tire was deflated. And members, if somebody was deflating tires for the purpose of hurting somebody, wouldn't they deflate more than one? Sometimes the obvious answer is the right one. Members, you also heard from Mrs. Tremont. She was in love. She loved her husband more than anything else in the world. And yes, they were going through a rocky relationship. And members, every relationship has its ups and downs. She would never do anything to hurt him. She herself told you that. You also saw the messages from Casey. You saw that she wanted to work it out. And members, she was waiting for him to come. Now, members, you're going to be given a verdict sheet with instructions, and I ask you to look very closely at those. As I mentioned earlier, any person charged with the commission of a crime is presumed to be innocent. And you must give the defendant the benefit of any doubt that arises from the evidence or want of evidence. And in this case, members, circumstantial evidence. There are two options for that verdict sheet, but only one is appropriate in this case. That you find Ms. Jolene Tremont not guilty. Members, this was not an investigation. It was a conclusion in search of evidence. Detective Seymour did not investigate an accident, a drunk driving accident. Detective Seymour investigated Jolene Tremont. On October 21st, 2021, two drunk individuals got in a car. They hit a pothole and ended up hitting a tree, and one of them died. Members, today, we ask you choose the obvious answer and find Ms. Jolene Tremont not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor.
You'll have 45 seconds.
Members of the jury. Now that we've heard from the defense, it seems that they want you to consider all of this to be mere coincidence. They want you to not take a look at the evidence from a bird's eye view, from a big picture. They insinuate another person, but where in the investigation does this other person come in? They say that there's a child with lipstick in our analogy, but we had a thorough investigation. We have an esteemed detective from here in our local county who says otherwise. There does not seem to be another person. There does not seem to be any type of evidence that would show against the contrary. I implore you to find the defendant guilty and make sure the person held responsible. Thank you.
Both will be dismissed. Give us a moment to deliberate and then we'll announce the winners.
Yeah, another. God. That's great job. Oh, are we gonna have to ride the end? I know we're gonna have to. Yeah. We have a YouTube account. You can see the competition there. Final round, you know, like toe to toe, well, like they should have won. Oh, no, at the record. I'm not arguing with those like that. Last year, this was our in-house competition with the college schools. So here it is like this 3, 4 time there was far. The liability days would be a problem. Yeah. What, I like anything.
All rise. No. The result of state versus Mississippi, or state of Mississippi versus Jolene Tremont is now in order. Judge Todd Conklin presiding.
Thank you. You may be seated.
No row, no judge.
Okay, I'm going to call the courtroom to order. And the winner for the prosecution, John Amlong. And the winner for the defense, Holly Miriam. All right, congratulations, everybody.
Yeah. Photo, real.
Hey, before you leave, we're gonna take some more photos. Everybody.
We're doing more photos. I don't know if I love the need for me.
Thanks again, see you on October 21st.
Your Honor, we've got our trial next week.
Yeah.
God, great flip, great flip. Congratulations. You did well. That's appreciated.
By the way, we're gonna take a picture of everybody that's in the bird.
I gotta go.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, you're shot back.
Done it.
Y'all can sit, honors.
John, congratulations. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks. We got 5.
Oh, yeah. Doing it in the garage?